Okay, we move to the third and last session for the day. And here we're going to have two presentations, slightly longer than the previous ones. One is going to be given by Ioana Petkova from the Royal College of Arts, and the other one from Ija Troiani from London South Bank University. The idea for this last session, as I said in the morning, is sort of to expand even further, that's sort of, blow up the issues that we've been looking at and maybe put them in a slightly wider context. We've already heard, in particular from Tom, sort of mentioning the notion of the commons, which I believe it might be coming back in the first of the two presentations. That is going to look at also as I understand, of course, I will see, the role of the architect within housing commons. And then the last presentation for the day is going to reflect on neoliberal architectural education and is going to include also a few clips, as I understand.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and it was really fascinating to hear all the stories and to hear everyone sharing their experience. I have, just to introduce myself, I have just finished my PhD at the Royal College of Art, which was looking on housing commons, and in London in particular, and I was specifically looking at community land trusts, so a little bit different but very related to cooperatives. And now I'm working at London South Bank University, so yes, the research is kind of slowly moving into a research project there. Yes, I guess we can start. The talk is based on the doctoral thesis, and Francesco asked me to talk about the role of the architect in housing commons and housing commoning. So we're going to start with a little bit of theory, and then we're going to talk about the case study, which is a community land trust in South London called Russ. And finally, we'll be speculating on the role of the architect and what kind of new possibilities this gives us. Of course, we know that home ownership today has become an increasingly profitable sector, and with that, this part of our profession has become increasingly controversial, and with the rental market providing also very little protection. So, at the moment, practicing and being an architect involves a kind of a double bind. On one hand, we must stay competitive to be able to remain in the financialized city, but at the same time, we are forced to continue and contribute to the status quo and kind of displace ourselves sometimes, quite often. And I'm talking about the average architect. I'm not talking about star architects. So there is this controversy, and the way out of this is perhaps, or what I would like us to think about today, or to invite you to think about, is to look at alternative modes of ownership and whether this could provide an alternative site for another agency and a new role for the architect. In most of the existing historiography, housing has been discussed as a matter of public right and universal right. And of course, this has been a very important and long chapter in architectural history. And municipal jobs in the 50s, working for the LCC was, for architects and recent graduates, it was a dream job. It was a very exciting place to be, but also it was a stable employment. And it gave this municipal architect, let's say, and this is, I guess, the first act of our talk today. The municipal architect was had this kind of stable employment, but also could act from or started from this position of certain authority and expertise. But at the same time, and British public housing was for sure a very successful social policy, but at the same time it operated through the ethos of modernism, and it also had its challenges. It was very universalizing. It also was very easy to privatize, and also very limiting when we think about self-organized models of owning, but also governing. So, yes, so today I would like to go even further back in history and think about housing as commons. And commons has been this kind of pre-modern model for owning and governing land, mainly. And it's really interesting because most of the literature and most of the debates today are referring to theory from the 60s. Let's say Elinor Ostrom, for example, is a very popular choice. And it's very interesting because most of the literature is always comparing the common in relation to the public and the private, and in between the public and the private. But what I would like to invite you to think about today is to go even further back and think about the common as this kind of pre-modern even relationship with the land and relationship with the local residents. What is really interesting, a few things are very interesting when we think about housing like that, is that this pre-modern legal concept included a very complex bundle of rights and duties, and they were not really only extractive and one-directional, but they also included ideas of care about the land and regeneration about the land. Owners were not only supposed to actually have access or take, but they were supposed to give back or care. So, yes. If we, on the other hand, try to deconstruct private ownership today, we also have this bundle of components. So you can sell, you can buy, you can bequeath, but you can exclude others from accessing it. And the commons also had different components, but they were distributed and they weren't centralized under a singular owner. So in that way, the commons provided this kind of universal access to the land. So we have this kind of complexity of someone actually owning land and having access to certain parts of the landscape, for example, the soil and the timber. But at the same time, we have local residents having access to the same land, but to other parts of the landscape, such as, for example, using pastures for grazing or gathering wood. So we have this kind of a more complex model of different stakeholders owning different parts of the common. And this is another thing that is important to mention here, that by entangling ownership and distributing it and entangling it into across a variety of stakeholders, we have this kind of sense of security, or we achieve more security than you would with this kind of singular ownership, centralized ownership. And in fact, a lot of the community land trusts or a lot of the organizations on the ground that I've come across are using this kind of decentralized ownership tactics to actually secure community assets or housing stock from being privatized or redeveloped. So this is still relevant when we think about housing today. Yeah, so how can we transition from this idea that we have about housing, which is actually grounded in this idea of public housing, into housing which could be inclusive or universally accessible, interdependent or entangled into this kind of different stakeholders, and regenerative, so including care and regenerating this housing stock and this housing resource. It is very important to say here that the municipal does not equal the common, so the municipal is not the public, they're very different in a way. The common actually started to be very prominent around, at least in architecture, after the 2008 housing crisis, which is really interesting to think about because there was this climate of austerity policies, and the Localism Act, which in Britain was one of the most decisive piece of legislation from 2011, came just after the housing crisis in 2008. So this gave communities the right to build and actually set the scene for a lot of the community-led housing projects that we can see today. And there was this kind of wave of projects. But it's really interesting that among the practitioners, among the architects who are dealing with the commons in practice, housing is actually avoided as a topic. They're looking at community farming or other kind of areas, but housing is not really discussed so broadly. And it is no surprise because housing is a very difficult field to comment in a way, and it exposes the participants to more vulnerability than any other sector. So in that sense, when we think about that, when we think about, I don't know, the expertise and the knowledge that one has to acquire in order to participate in those community-led housing projects and to develop your own housing stock. This is quite a lot to ask of many people, and especially people with full-time employment and especially people with care responsibility. So we can say that at the moment when we talk about housing and when we talk about commoning, housing commons are not really universally accessible. We can very openly say this. To be able to think about how we can make them more accessible, we can think about adding more to housing to secure other fields like employment or care. And I really like the example from Canada with the nursery, right? Because you can see this kind of, it's almost like a whole reality or a whole utopian world that is encapsulated into one building. So, so what I realized in my research is that in order to be autonomous, you have to rely on others. In order to be independent, you have to be interdependent because autonomy can only work through this kind of interdependencies and collaborations with others. So perhaps it's really important to distinguish here between three different terms. Common, singular, which was originally used to refer to a piece of land on the common, for example. Commoning, which is but the common in, let's say, political theoretical literature, such as, I don't know, Negri and Hart, the common is this kind of collective state of discontent where with some kind of structural issue. So it's more of a prefigurative state of being, while commoning is this moment of collective action where there is a practice, there's some kind of act enacted. And commons, plural, is this kind of already achieved collective resource, which might be material, which might be immaterial. It involves a lot of social relationships with it, as we mentioned earlier today. So we can say that at the moment, while housing commons are not achieved yet, housing commoning is taking place, this kind of practice or action of collective organizing and self-organizing, and this is the primary site where architects can actually explore a new role and look for a new social mandate for architecture. So from this kind of broad repertoire of self-organizing around housing, two models are especially relevant in addressing today's financialization, and these are the community land trust and the limited equity or non-equity co-ops. And the way that they work is that the community land trusts are having this kind of distributed governance and ownership system where we always have this tripartite structure representing public, communal, and private interests, so entangling and distributing governance and ownership throughout different parties. And the limited and non-equity co-ops have this kind of mechanisms for community-led rent or price control, as we mentioned already. As we can see here, community land trusts are really, really small part of London's, or actually, of London's housing grassroots organizations. This was, I have to say that this was a spreadsheet that was very kindly shared with me by someone who was working in a co-op. And I cannot really guarantee how accurate it is still. It was from 2021. So yes, just to mention that. So limited equity and non-equity co-ops versus community land trusts. There are several, when we look at the kind of diagram of organization, the co-ops have this kind of one member, one vote principle that they operate on. And what is very typical for them is that they're rather enclosed. They're mostly smaller, even though we have heard today that we have co-ops of 800 members, which is quite impressive. But then they resort to management boards and all these kind of different structures. And the community land trusts are much larger because they are more representative. They work through always including this kind of tripartite structure of private versus communal versus public. But the advantage of that is that they can grow, right? They can have a lot of different members, a lot of different plots of land across the city. Yes, so this is the main difference between both of them. So today I would like to talk about community land trust in South London, RUS. It stands for Rural Urban Synthesis Society. And in my PhD, this is where I have done my field work. They're in Lewisham in South London, and this is their inaugural housing project, their first housing project, called Church Grove. They are just completing it. I think they're at a stage where they are completing the fit out. Yes, it includes 30 plus units, and yes, it's almost there, almost completed. This is a diagram of how Church Grove and RUS are actually operating in terms of governance and ownership. We have this traditional split of freehold and leasehold, and the land is actually originally owned by the council. And leased to the Community Land Trust for 250 years. And the building itself is owned by the private residents and the Community Land Trust. And also there is a social provider involved in the governance of that. There are several social rent units. And in terms of governance structure, RUS has over 1,000 members, which is quite impressive. But most of them are not actively involved in the running of the organizations. Actually, they have a very an active front of around, I think, 60 people who are constantly changing. So I think I really relate to the comments that we had in the previous panel, that knowledge getting lost, and then people being overwhelmed, having to drop in and out, and then people who no longer have this knowledge, wondering what happened in a planning meeting 5 years ago. So yeah, we have this active front, and also we have, in terms of, let's say, a private interest or a private stakeholder, we have the future residents, the communal or the community stakeholder, in this case is RUS, and on the members, but also the board of trustees. And we have the public stakeholder, which is the London Borough of Lewisham. Of course, from this diagram, you can see that there are local residents or local actors or stakeholders that are not part of the governance diagram, which is, again, an omission, and Russ are really working on these relationships. The social tenants, for example, were not actively involved in the development of the site, so they're coming on board later. So yes, this is how Russ is working at the moment, and this is a plan of the project, and we can see that there is this really awkward shaped plot, which is squeezed between the Ravensbourne River and the end of Church Grove, which is a dead-end street. And we have this kind of two volumes of which are connected by a walkway. And on the bookends of those volumes, the inner ones, here and here, we have communal facilities. We have, so all the units are perpendicular to the river, and they're accessed by the shared walkway, which is a kind of a tribute to this traditional deck access London housing, but it's a little bit more generous here to provide more shared communal opportunities for the local residents. If we look at the units, actually, we can see that they're quite conventional. And one reason is for that is that even in a community land trust, the units are the part that is the most financialized part. And those of you who are working with developing co-ops or starting up co-ops know how financially restrictive this could be. Even if it's a co-op, it's still, you need to comply with the bank or with the funder. So if the units are this kind of hyper-financialized part of the project, and the awkward shape of the site is an outcome of leftover plots which the local authorities give to community-led projects. Everything that happens in between is actually the most exciting part for us architects, because everything that happens in between is this common project which involves different types and scales of collectivity and different levels of participation. Oh, yeah, just to mention that there were architects involved in the development of this scheme. It wasn't just participatory. So John Broom and Archetype were actually leading the design of this building. And initially the idea was to self-build. And in a building at this scale, self-building could happen only through getting a contractor, finishing the rough frame or the shell, and then the participants would come in and do the fit-out, the interior. They would finish the interior. And it's really beautiful because this project comes from another very important project in Lewisham, which is two schemes by the architect Walter Siegel. They're self-built schemes, and they're quite popular. For architects, but also in Lewisham, Walter's Way and Siegel Close. In fact, Walter Siegel was teaching here at the AA, where he met Colin Ward, as we mentioned earlier today, and also John Turner, who both of them were working on democratizing the planning process and participatory design. So as a result, we got this council project, which produced these two schemes. They were social housing, and they were funded by the council, but initiated by Walter Siegel and the council. And they were a little bit different than Church Grove, of course, because of their funding, but also because of their ownership. But also because of the role of the architect. And in fact, we can see here that the Walter Siegel was very interested in creating this this manual of how to build your own house, and the self-builders only had a very basic carpentry training when they started, and this is an issue of AJ from 1986. John Broom was involved in that as well, where we have a manual how to build your own home in a few very easy steps. It's a modular system. It's very easy to put together from planning until the very detailing. But what this did is two things. One of them was to completely remove the architect from this process, right? And the other one was to create a modular building which would be able to exist anywhere by anyone, and it would have absolutely no real connection to the site or to the context. Which in a way is very different than the municipal project or the municipal role of the architect, and very different from the role of the architect which might be enabled by the commons. Yes, so if we think about this kind of not the municipal, but the neoliberal architect, and this kind of double bind that we started with, that you have to be competitive, but still you're complying to the status quo and displacing yourself almost from your neighborhood. Almost. Then this is a very special condition which enables much more a different positionality and a different relationship between the participant and the architect. And while here the architect was still holding on to this role of the expert, or this kind of role of expert knowledge, today the architect is much more valuable much more valuable, but also much more vulnerable in terms of the shared and common stakes that we have in developing this kind of alternative to the financialized city. So it's a slightly different position that we're talking about today. And the kind of types of plots that local authorities give to community land, to community-led initiatives, this kind of awkward leftover plots that are not really viable for any commercial development, just go to show that architects can be very valuable in this situation. So we have architects that are vulnerable, have common stakes, but also can be very valuable in this exchange, but also embody this problem. They're part of the problem. So I would like to propose today another role of the architect that we can think of together, probably, which is the coalitional architect. And I borrow the term coalitions from it originated in the civil rights movement, but also then later was adopted in the field of feminist studies to address identity politics in collective action and the challenges and resolutions that this might bring. Here I would like to invite everyone to think about this kind of role of the coalitional architect, because coalitions, as defined by feminist thinkers, are always embodied. They are always based on shared stakes, and they are always grounded in action, or in acting or participating. They're not just talking, or they're not just about allying with someone. It's about doing something. So where does this new role of the architect take place? As we said, it's between this kind of conventional private development and the edge of this kind of awkward plots, public plots. So this is where a variety of different scales and types of collectivity takes place, from the kind of neighborly gardens that we have in Church Grove, which is this kind of area around the building, through the common hub, educational hub, where training and activities take place and other organizations are visiting, to this kind of mutual walkways and mutual facilities which are reserved for the residents only. It is this gap between the private and the public that cannot really be standardized. It cannot really be streamlined, and it requires case-by-case spatial solutions. And it's here where our new agency or new values can actually emerge. And here maybe we can go back to this idea of housing as commons, as this kind of regenerative but also interdependent and inclusive, universally accessible resource, and think about the steps that we need to do professionally to actually support that. here, this is Russ's plan here on the left. They're running, I forgot to mention, they're running a Rus school where they educate other groups to start their own community land trusts and housing projects. And their program is divided in a few simple steps: group, site, plan, build, and live. And perhaps we can think about closing the circuit and thinking about having a more professional service, or at least a participatory core, or a specialist, let's say, board in a community land trust, which deals with this kind of a more spatial or more kind of development architectural side. Of course, this would mean that participation would be limited to a certain extent, but then again, it's a very fine balance between participation and professionalization, and making sure that everybody can be involved if they want to. And then, and then it's about keeping in mind that autonomy is not about independence, it's about interdependence, and trying to make those links and link up different areas. There is a scholar called James de Philippis, and a book called Unmaking Goliath, where they talk about housing cannot be autonomous unless work and finance are kind of decoupled at the same time. So perhaps when we think about housing, maybe it's work and finance, but maybe things like labor or resources are also very important. And such projects outside of housing already exist in the city. It's just a matter of finding them and linking them together. As we said, there are spaces of education, such as the hub at Church Grove, but also there are places of food production. This is Loughborough Farm in Brixton, and this is actually, in fact, a student project by Tom Dobson, Public Works, currently. It used to be a student project. It's the greenhouse at Loughborough Farm, where Tom actually used this building to claim land or claim ownership of this site, which was at that time squatted by the farm. And also there are sites for gathering and storing and reusing resources. This is the Remakery, which is a communal workshop and a resource material bank in Brixton. So this is just to say that everything is there that we need to link up different commoning loops and make them more autonomous. Architecture can be used to make a claim, to produce objects to hold and govern the territory of the distributed common city, where private becomes instrumentalized in developing an alternative to the financialized city. And the common is in this gap between this hyper-financialized private and the withdrawing public. And here architects can actually reclaim their social value, but also experiment with alternative models of practice, and if not quite outside of commercial pressures, experiment with other values, other spatial values. Of course, this is a very exciting place to also study architecture, and for architecture students and for education. And to unlearn and explore alternative ways of thinking about space and building space in more inclusive, interdependent and regenerative ways. And I'm going to end up on this slide, which is a research project which we have just started, called Common Gardens at London South Bank University with Valerio Massaro, and Ija has been very supportive in that, where we are actually trying to see community farms as prototypes for learning about sustainability. And I'm going to end on this slide and pass it over to Ija.